Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Andrei Lankov, who is going to speak on the topic of the cracks in alliance, Soviet Union and North Korea in 1955-60. Actually, Professor Lankov doesn't need much introduction because he has been a regular speaker at the Royal Asiatic Society Korea Branch for the past over 10 years. I think he has spoken about a dozen times.
Something like that, yes.
Anyway, there's a saying in Korea that if one does not know the well-known figure or person or well-known facts, we say that you must be from North Korea. If you don't know Professor Lankov, you must be from North Korea. Anyway, Professor Lankov studied at the Leningrad State University, where he did his undergraduate and PhD. I think his PhD dissertation was on factionalism of late Yi Dynasty, right? And he also taught at the Australian National University from 1995 to 2004. Since 2004, he has been teaching at Kookmin University as a tenured professor. He also studied at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang in the 1980s. His main research interest is in North Korea, things on North Korea. And he has published a number of books and articles. He has written so many books, I just want to introduce a few of them. The Crisis in North Korea, the Failure of De-Stalinization, 1956. From Stalin to Kim Il-sung, the formation of North Korea, 1945 to 60. North of DMZ, essays on daily life in North Korea. The real North Korea, actually, the several copies are available for sale in the back. And also he contributed a number of articles, contributed to Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, Newsweek, and he also published a number of academic articles, including 2 articles in Foreign Affairs. So without further ado, let's welcome Andrei Lankov with a big round of applause.
Thank you for inviting me, but there is one thing I would like to make absolutely clear. We are not going to talk today about current developments. And if anybody is going to ask questions about current developments, UN Security Council, everything, I will politely but firmly refuse to answer such questions. Because otherwise, we are going to spend a lot of time on the stuff journalists love that much, but which is about to be forgotten in half a year or a bit longer. Having said that, what we are going to talk today is a very important part of North Korean history, and it's to some extent it's still important now, because just when we having a dinner about half an hour ago, basically a question was raised about the new brilliant idea of Mr. Kissinger, who said that United States and China should sit down and determine the future of North Korea. I would strongly advise Mr. Kissinger, with all due respect, I don't think he will have time for reading my books, which are large and boring, but maybe his secretary will write for him a short summary of what happened in 1956, when the Soviet Union and China sat down and outlined the future of North Korea. A bit of spoiler is that the future of North Koreans were not impressed, and they did what they wanted. Basically, what they did was probably, well, frankly, not very good for most of the North Koreans who supported this policy initially, but it was their policy. And it was a really spectacular failure, both of the Soviet Union and China. The collapse of the alliance, I would say. But first of all, a bit of introduction. When Korea was divided almost by chance, the late 1940s was a very interesting period in the North Korean history. Fortunately, we have a great deal of documents, but as we have just discussed with one of you people who are doing study of these documents minutes ago, there is a problem. All these documents available now are in Russian. And the message, the major, the stuff you are going to learn from these documents does not resonate well with the sensible hearts of the mainstream professors of Korean history at the Korean universities. Well, and Russian is a difficult language, and we are not going to invest a lot of time to learn something you'd rather not to know. We would prefer not to know. But going back to this situation is, there is a contradiction in North Korean studies, to an extent this field exists, it's a very small field, about the late 1940s. Some people say that North Korea in the late 1940s was a Soviet puppet state. It's usually the conservatives, the right in South Korea, their kind of version in a very simplified manner is, we had a wonderful, great nation, everybody wanted to live under liberal democracy, maybe not necessarily, but maybe personified by Mr. Syngman, but then the Russians came and the evil puppets, backed by the Russian tanks, established the government. Another idea, much propagated by the local left and a significant number of the left-leaning academics in the West, unfortunately I have to talk politics. I think that politics is bad for history, but in this case it's vital to understand who is saying what. Their line is something like, we had a North Korean revolution, occupation versus revolution. That is, North Korea, all people in Korea wanted to have a progressive socialist government, but in the South, this spontaneous movement was suppressed by the evil Americans and Syngman, and in North Korea it triumphed, but unfortunately, due to some reasons they prefer not to talk, it did not produce good results. Wonderful. What can I say? Both are right. On one hand, it was a Soviet occupation. The level of the Soviet control and intervention, as we now can see from the Soviet documents, was quite remarkable. It will suffice to say that the constitution of the North Korea, 1948 constitution, was edited by Stalin himself. He spent entire work night, because he usually worked in nights, not days, reading through the constitution, arguing with his legal scholars, accepting some of the ideas and rejecting some others, and rewriting at least 3 articles in the constitution. When North Koreans decided to have a military parade in February 1948, how did it happen? The Soviet Politburo had a special meeting, a lot of questions. One of the items is North Korea decision to allow, разрешить for those who speak Russian, разрешить, allow, permit. The North Korean government, the North Korean authorities to have a military parade in Pyongyang with participating, I'm not sure, 1 division, or they even mentioned how many units, 1 or 2 divisions. So everything was 2 divisions, yes. Control. It's 1948 Politburo decision. Wonderful. But at the same time, it was revolution. Because within nationalist frame of mind, it's very difficult to accept that some foreign imposed government can be popular, but it can. For the average North Korean farmer who received his land in 1946 as a result of the land reform, it did not matter at all that from the very beginning to the end, the land reform law was drafted by the Russians. First of all, nobody told him about it or her. Second, had somebody told, he probably said, so what? And he has been smart and pragmatic and cynical, he said, well, maybe it's even better. Russians have good specialists in agriculture. We don't have it. Indeed, they didn't have it back then. So So the policy of Kim Il-sung government in the late 1940s enjoyed a significant support from below, but to a very large extent the government was following the Soviet blueprints. So it was both occupation and revolution. I would say it was a popular revolutionary occupational government. So, problem is, when the Soviet as military, working together with a great measure of support from below, began to build a communist state, they had a major problem. They had no communists in North Korea. Because they had very few, a small number. Most of the ethnic Korean communists by 1945 operated overseas. Therefore, the policy was very simple. They began to get people, to invite people. Nearly all of them were absolutely enthusiastic about going into Korea. It was not that they were forced, they wanted it. Because they were Koreans and they wanted to build a communist paradise in Korea. And these people are ready to build paradise could be found in, first, Chinese Communist Party, so-called Yan'an group named after the town of Yan'an, where there used to be headquarters of the Chinese communists. Then, a significant number of the well-educated but seriously Russified, Russian-speaking, sometimes not speaking in Korean at all, ethnic Koreans in the Soviet Communist Party, then underground in Seoul, and then a small number of people who once used to fight under Kim Il-sung command as a part of the armed resistance in Manchuria. Important, there were other branches of resistance, but we are talking about a particular one. All these people created the foundation of the government. There were four groups, so-called four factions. Each had its very specific background, up to the language they usually normally speaking. And education, everything was quite different. But together, they were roughly equal. If you look at the composition of the top North Korean government bodies in the late 1940s, you have roughly one quarter of all four groups. Chinese, Koreans, Soviet Koreans, South Korean Koreans, and Kim Il-sung's Koreans. Kim Il-sung's soldiers were, as a matter of fact, less educated. Very few of them even graduated from a high school, but they were tough, committed, reasonably selfless. Well, all of them were more or less selfless. There was corruption, everything, but basically they were selfless, they were idealists. But Kim Il-sung people were committed, and in the end of the day, because Kim Il-sung was partially maneuvered himself, partially largely was chosen by the Soviet government to run the emergent state, again, which does not mean that he was not popular, he began to basically gradually put his people on the position of power. Then we had Korean War, 1950, 1953, and in 1953, North Korea emerged as a quite typical pro-Soviet state. Like a lot of such states existed in Europe, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, even though there was one vital difference. That is, say in Poland, back then, the local communist government was largely seen as a bunch of Moscow puppets. It was not particularly popular. In some East European countries, communists were popular. In most countries, not. In North Korea, the government enjoyed a great deal of local support, not least because people who didn't like the new system could virtually walk away in 1950 during the Korean War, when roughly over 1 million North Koreans moved here. 10% of population. So opposition exiled itself, essentially. So, what was happening? And as you know, in March 1953, Stalin died. And the new leaders began to force a new policy line, which at that time came to be known as New Course. We usually associate the New Course with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader of the 10 years after Stalin. But he was not the initiator. As a matter of fact, it was his arch-enemy, Lavrentiy Beria, who started it. but it's a kind of part of the Russian history. What is important, there were some disagreements in Moscow about details, but the general line was, it's time to do things differently. Khrushchev and Beria hated one another, not only because of personal ambitions, but on this point they had very similar ideas. What did they want? First, and the new course, which was implemented in the Soviet Union from 1953, first by Beria and Manenkov, then by Khrushchev, was different from the old Stalin line in many regards. First of all, Stalin wanted tanks and fighter planes, which probably made some sense given the situation in the 1930s. But in the age of nuclear weapons, the policy was, the new course was much softer on population. Because the idea that you have to have heavy and chemical industry at any cost, if it means massive destitution, malnourishment, and even starvation, this idea did not sell anymore. I will mention it a bit later. There are some very interesting twists in this situation. So, it didn't sell anymore. The idea was that new course, first, less emphasis on the heavy and chemical industry, more emphasis on consumption goods and agriculture. Second, much less repressive government. I usually like to play a game with the Americans or any Westerns. I ask them, how many political prisoners do you think there were in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev? I usually get figures saying 50,000, 10,000. And they say, no, less than 2,000 in the worst periods, sometimes less than 1,000. When Stalin died, it was close to 1 million. You had 1,000-fold decrease in number of political prisoners within 5 years. Arguably, the most radical liberalization of the surveillance and control without regime change in known history. And it was not only conducted in the Soviet Union, it was essentially imposed on other countries. So the logic was, do it. And in this regard, neither Beria nor Khrushchev were much different from Stalin. Probably they were even more pushy. So Stalin sometimes allowed for some local varieties. They did not. It's not because it's done in Moscow, you should do it. Frankly, most of East European countries welcomed the new policy because they found Stalin's approach excessive and dangerous and humanless, and it did not resonate well with the still sort of remaining idealism of many communist leaders. But what was happening in North Korea? In North Korea, Kim Il-sung was not going to like the new law. To start with, Kim Il-sung fully understood that in order to keep power, he had to get rid of potential rivals. And he could not trust anybody but his own guerrillas. Because for the South Korean communists, like Park Hong-yeon, the founder of the Korean Communist Party, Kim Il-sung was essentially an insignificant field commander from the Julian Backwater. While real stuff was happening, of course, in Seoul, in Shanghai, in Yan'an, in Moscow, in Tokyo. For the Soviets and for the North Chinese, he also was not that powerful person, and they both felt support of great powers behind their backs. So, Kim Il-sung began removing members of different factions using the traditional type of show trial. In 1953, he had leaders of the South Korean communists who were largely responsible for guerrilla operations and underground work in South Korea arrested. Of course, they all admitted they were American spies. They told in great details about how American diplomats happened to give them instructions, and it became clear that many of the diplomats were simply not in Korea at that time when they were allegedly given instructions, so they could not even write proper scenario. But anyway, they said they were running doors of the American imperialism. They begged for right punishment. They got death sentence. End of story. prominent communist activist in the 1930s. Back then, to be a member of a Politburo in a communist state was probably arguably the world's most dangerous job. Having said that, so he had Soviet and Chinese faction, and he began to face this new Soviet demand. Butter, but not guns. Repression, yes, but only against people who are openly challenging the system. Not about some quotas about a number of enemies of the state you have to amass, and peaceful coexistence and collective leadership is something I should mention. I did not, especially wrote some very small notes not to lose structure, not to forget about structure. I still forgot, because apart from new economic policy, apart from less repressive line, of course, critique of the personality cult. The idea that the leader is not a god, that the country should be run by a collective dictatorship of Politburo, not by the individual person. And Kim Il-sung didn't like it, because of very simple reasons. One reason is quite, but most people say, yes, he just loved power. Of course he did. Because can you show me a single politician, high-level politician or CEO who hates power? Such people exist, but they are definitely not that numerous. What was more important, the ideas as idea, he understood that if he starts reducing his own kind of official profile, it will be damaging for him and his loyal guerrillas, ex-guerrillas, and he didn't want it. He believed that he and these people knew what Korea should become. And his attitude was pretty much similar to what Stalin himself believed, but probably more radical. When I usually talk about North Korea under Kim Il-sung, I usually say that he was more Stalinist than just Stalin himself. But it's because his mindset and mindset of people around him was much more Stalinist. These people did not really care that much about living standards of the population. They say, well, maybe a couple of generations we will have it. Right now, we need a powerful state. They remember the humiliation of the Japanese rule. They believed, even if it means death of 250,000 farmers, we need to have guns and missiles. So no Japan, no America, no Russia, no China, no Indonesia will ever do to us anything like that. Which is sort of understandable, and if it's more understandable, exactly because people who have such lofty ideas were not going to starve to death anyway. Still, believe in the need for powerful military and therefore heavy and chemical industry, steel and planes and tanks and everything. First. Second, he could not accept the idea of the peaceful coexistence. The new idea of the Soviet leadership who said that a nuclear war should be avoided. Not because Kim Il-sung wanted a nuclear war, but because he basically believed that, Khrushchev, by that time it was already Khrushchev, not Beria. Beria was dead by that time, killed by Khrushchev. But otherwise, probably Beria would kill Khrushchev, but I don't think it would make much difference in terms of the policy. But the idea was that, look, Soviet Union should avoid a nuclear war because it might become a humankind suicide. We need to make compromises with the Americans, what Khrushchev said, and make mutual concessions. But for Kim Il-sung, a vital task was still unification of the country by force if necessary. And he was afraid that if there is a revolutionary situation in South Korea, back then he hoped that one day the South Korean people will rise against the Mali government. And he would be able to use it. But he would be stopped by the Russians from doing it, because Russians will make a deal behind his back with Americans. By the way, his fears were partially justified much later during the missile crisis, but we have no time to talk about it today. So, he was afraid that peaceful coexistence will mean some kind of deal made by the Russians and Americans against his will, behind his back, and against his and his country's long-term interest. He believed that emphasis on the consumption and higher living standards will undermine the military potential of the future South Korean state. He believed that a collective leadership Soviets began to demand would basically deprive him and his supporters from power, which is sweet enough, but they hope to build a career they were dreaming about. A unified national state, run by a wise leader, with dedicated masses, will be working full of enthusiasm, for no monetary reward but receiving free rations, working very hard for free rations, fighting for the great goals. Well, maybe officials will get a bit more rations, but not that much more. Equality, commitment, nation goal, unity, greatness. Attractive? Yes, it was damn attractive. This ideal, which is probably not very attractive to many people in this room, won a great deal of support in Korea, where most of the people were still children of the subsistence farmers, where they had essentially very pre-modern worldview and at the same time had a great deal of modern nationalism, where they were traumatized by the Korean War, but especially by the Japanese occupation. And let's not forget that with the exception of maybe 1,000 people on the top, 99.9% of the North Koreans back then sincerely believed that the Korean War was started by the Americans. So they believed that the disaster was a result, again, yet another foreign invasion. Very few people were aware that it was an unsuccessful attempt to unify the country. So, it meant a major problem, and starting from 1954, Kim Il-sung began to look with increasing suspicion to Moscow and to people inside the country who could be supportive of the new ideas. But such people existed. Starting from roughly 1955, 1954, many North Korean officials began to quietly talk that in the new situation, the Soviet Union, the new Soviet line, the new course should be emulated. And most of them, understandably, were the Soviet Koreans. And there was a great deal of the Soviet Koreans, many of whom occupied the top positions in the government. And these people, they had sort of dual loyalty. They were both North Koreans and Soviets. And you can be surprised how much the Soviet embassy could know about all top secret dealing of the North Korean government, because within a few days, some of the Soviet Koreans who attended some top secret meeting would immediately brief somebody from the embassy about what was going on there. And they did not see it as a betrayal. They just believed that it was sort of their duty to, I'm pretty sure the information went other way as well, with an important caveat that they had no serious access within Moscow, and pretty much absolute access within country. And these people began to say that we should follow the Soviet line. And their argument was much strengthened by a seriously underreported economic disaster which happened in 1954-1955. Winter 1954-1955 was the winter of a serious famine in North Korea. It was not the scale of the late 1990s, but probably few 10,000 people starved to death during these few months, which, as North Korean leaders eventually admitted, was to a very large extent result of excessive pressure, excessive demand for food, and first attempts to collectivize agriculture. And finally, in January 1955, the North Korean government, which initially denied all these stories, all reports about famine, a bit like Mao denied the first reports about the Great Reform, but they understood the situation is getting tough, and Park Chan-ok, a former Soviet military intelligence officer, who was at that time the highest of all Soviet Koreans, was sent to Moscow to ask for urgent food aid. And the aid was delivered and this issue was eventually sorted out. But what is interesting for me, when I read about all the documents about these developments, what is a bit funny? People who were protesting the excessively harsh treatment of the North Korean farmers were exactly the same people who were responsible for massive famine in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. Molotov, Khrushchev, they were exactly the people writing kind of panicking reports. They are going crazy, we should stop them immediately, they are starving people. Exactly the people who just 20 years ago in their own country had no problems about starving farmers. Why? I have two explanations. First, people tend to get wiser. Maybe they remember what happened and they didn't want it to happen to other countries after all. Second, probably they saw back in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, when the Second World War just behind the corner, probably it made sense to starve 1 million or 2 million of farmers. But why on the hell they are doing it in North Korea? They don't need such an urgency. For us it was a survival. We need tanks immediately. We need grain, we need factories, we need tanks. Why in North Korea? But still it's a bit funny to see people who are, say, in modern Russian historiography, both liberal and nationalist, are usually presented as great kind of, mass murderers of the Russian farmers, to be as pretty devoted, committed, and compassionate protectors of the North Korean farmers. Nonetheless, and as a matter of fact, their intervention worked pretty well. They sent sort of ultimatum to, forget I should not move away from the camera. Well, anyway, so they sent essentially an ultimatum, and it was given to Kim Il-sung during his semi-secret, not exactly secret, but not much publicized, trip to Moscow in 1955, which basically said that you should essentially get softer on farmers, seriously softer. And he did it, and he got aid from Russia, he got food from China. Back then China was doing well, Great Leap Forward was still ahead. Mao did not start civil experiments with his people, so still enough food, that he got food, food was distributed, basically the number of victims was not as high as it would probably have been otherwise, but people who basically were skeptical about Kim Il-sung, they began to say, look what we have, where we have got this is old policy. We nearly ended up with a massive starvation. Do something about it. And Kim Il-sung began to react. In the new situation, as you remember, there were three groups. One group was essentially Kim Il-sung, his supporters. Three others were South Korean Seoul people who were by that time largely physically exterminated. Second group and third group were Soviet and Chinese Koreans. In this new situation, both groups became dangerous, because at that time China was pretty supportive of very similar policy. But it was a major source of threat was Moscow. So what did Kim Il-sung do? He began to remove North Soviet Koreans from the positions of power. And from 1955, one after another, prominent Soviet Koreans found themselves to be criticized. It culminated in late 1955. And they were usually accused of being wrong on the cultural and literary politics. Which was a bit funny, because most of these people spoke limited Korean. And they were not much involved with literature, because as one of them, by the way, Park Chan-wook himself, frankly admitted that he is not capable of reading Korean fiction. Why? Obviously because maybe it was an influence of one Soviet campaign from 1946, more likely it was just an idea that these accusations will sound less dangerous. So they criticized not for something serious, like opposition to, emphasis on the heavy industry, but on something light, they did not like correct writers, they extolled bad writers with dubious political tendencies, so nothing. Anyway, it was first kind of campaign which allowed Kim Il-sung to get rid of a number of the Soviet Koreans by late 1955. As a matter of fact, he also had the most powerful mouse contact in North Korea, General Pakeru, former Minister of the Interior, and the sort of liaison with Chinese forces. Also around this time, he was removed and even briefly put under arrest. So, and what is interesting, by the way, in December 1955, Kim Il-sung delivered a speech which everybody knows. It was a speech about establishment of Chechnya. And it was quite funny to read how this speech was described a bit later, a few years later. Not this speech, the idea of Chechnya in 1959 was described in the Soviet embassy documents. They said, Chechnya was an idea of Kim Chang-ma. It was Secretary for Ideology, who was so proud of this idea. Chechnya means superiority of everything Korean over everything foreigner. And Kim Jong-un, he was носился с этой идеей, how would say, he was pushing this idea on everybody. Then he was quite briefly, and he's now getting a bit excessively active with these ideas. So look, for the Soviet embassy, it was not a great idea of Kim Il-sung. It was just a strange idea suggested by Kim Il-sung's kind of ideological kind of supreme ideological kind of theoretician, which is probably to be the case. When we say that about the idea of Chechnya, we have to remember that in real life ideas, Chechnya ideas were created by Kim Chang-man and developed by Hwang Chang-wook in the 1960s. Kim Il-sung probably, or Kim Jong-un had very little to do with that. But anyway, so meanwhile, situation kept developing. As you know, in late February 1956, the Soviet Communist Party had the 20th Congress, which where the attacks on Stalin culminated, and where Khrushchev delivered his secret speech. The Soviet embassy approached Kim Il-sung, suggesting that he should go to Moscow. He said no, and he sent his most trusted lieutenant, to Moscow, where he basically remained as passive as possible, and came back with documents of the 20th Congress, which had to be distributed. Let's not forget, officially it was still the time when everything happening in the Soviet Union was officially considered a target of emulation. It was officially said openly in all kind of media, all kind of propaganda, the Soviet Union cannot possibly do anything wrong. And even if it's not what people, decision makers, believed, and they were, as I have said, trying to basically get rid of the Soviet Union, they could not admit it. But it was quite remarkable that they did not. Unfortunately, I cannot switch off my phone because of the personal situation. Just very briefly, my mother is at hospital, so if it's called from hospital, I will take it, because right now there is nobody looking after her. And yes, but so I cannot switch it off. Yeah. So next. This situation, he decided not to go about, and the in kind of publications about 23rd Congress were kept under control, but by that time, actually from earlier period, from late 1955, the dangerous combination of what? Personality cult, back then came somewhere, began to spread in North Korea. And because it was set in the Soviet Union, Kim Il-sung had to do something. Because all communist parties were ordered to purge, to get rid of the personality cult. What did he do? Two things. Very interesting way. For more open audience, he said, yes, of course, we Koreans should do what the Poles, Czechs, or back then, Czechoslovakians, Bulgarians are doing. We should get rid of the personality cult. And you know, the official line continued, the personality cult existed in our state, in our country. It was the personality cult of Park Hong-yeol. The evil leader of the Seoul communists, really an American spy, was introducing his personality cult, and we should fight with it, officially. If you look classified stuff, different story. Still the same too, but there is another story. If you belong to the top 1%, Kim Il-sung's family said something like, in my book, I think they were not that bad, not as bad as they used to believe. They worked reasonably well, and they were trying to get intelligence and analyze what was going on. Probably they could do a better job, but it was not a disaster, so they were trying to get. And still there are a lot of people who are doing better. Anyway, so, like Starinka does. But look, so this type of story. And at the same time, remember, 20th Century Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, February. And in April 1956, a Congress of the Third Congress of the Korean Workers' Party. And Kim Il-sung was a bit tense, because he was afraid that some of the Soviet officials would start a mess. The Congresses by that time were pretty much kind of fake, highly controlled gathering, where no discussion was possible. But in the new situation, when the strange news were coming from overseas, including Moscow, you did not know what to do. So Kim Il-sung was quite tense about the Congress, and as a matter of fact, in Albania, a bit later, not a Congress, but a party conference got out of control. There was only one case when the control over such gathering of officials was lost, but it did happen, not in North Korea, in a different country, but very similar country, by the way. Albania and North Korea were remarkably similar. I just feel sorry that so few Koreans know Albanian and vice versa, because comparison will be very interesting. Anyway, and his fears were basically much strengthened because of two events. The Soviet delegation in the Third Congress was presided by a young, sporty, charming, charismatic, energetic, rising politician whose name was Leonid Brezhnev. He was not a general secretary, but he was a rising star. And he had a great deal of personal talk with a member of the Politburo whose surname was Pak, and whose given name was, as it was usually transcribed in Korean, Ivan. As you guessed, he was Ivan Pak, a Russian engineer working there. And they had a great deal of mutual chemistry with Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a very charming person in personal life, actually. And Pak Ivan, who was also known for basically his kind of straight talking, no nonsense, a kind of basically engineer, and he basically told Brezhnev a lot of things which were happening, this kind of quite pushing Soviet Korean society, this recent famine, all this stuff they discussed. They were basically going together to the countryside. They spent 3 days or 4 days talking. And Brezhnev delivered a speech, which of course had to be very prominent, because back then everybody knew that the Soviet Union was the boss. So Brezhnev was delivering the speech, he said to the Third Congress that we hope, we great and mighty Moscow, that the Korean Workers' Party will deal with the issue of the personality cult. It was not what Kim Il-sung wanted to hear. It was. He learned that there was an official who was writing letters and maps telling that North Korea should immediately change the course. It was not just, this kind of quiet talking letter. In Hungary, well, from in Korean script they don't say Hungary. Yes, and this person was, surprisingly, Isan-jo, the ambassador, the North Korean ambassador to Moscow, who was appointed by Kim Il-sung in early August 1955, exactly because Kim Il-sung assumed that this guy, who had spent all his lifetime in China or in North Korea, dealing with espionage and special operations, was the least likely person to be influenced by the Soviet liberalism. You take your former spy master, he was the chief of North Korean intelligence during the war. He was a very efficient, very ruthless, very hard-line underground operative in China in the 1930s, 1940s. You take such a person, you send him to Khrushchev's Moscow, and in 6 months he turns liberal. Wow. really dangerous ideology. And he nearly had Isanjo arrested, but then finally under pressure, because Isanjo was a kind of living legend of the local underground, there's a great deal of connection, he let him go. I believe that he felt sorry about it for many years, and to the best of my knowledge, the last semi-successful assassination attempt against Isanjo by the North Korean intelligence took place in 1989. Maybe later there is something I'm not aware of. So, he let him go. Where, as you guess from this remark, he was going to become a central character in the unusual drama of a defecting ambassador. Anyway, so, and exactly when things will begin boiling, and news from Europe, change of the leadership in Bulgaria, change in leadership of the Greek Communist Party. For now it doesn't sound a great deal, but back then Greek Communist Party was really big. They lost the civil war in the late 1940s, and they were very, very important in that period. Then growing discontent in Poland, growing problems in Hungary, just about before the October uprising and October-November revolution in Hungary, things are getting tough. So, Kim Il-sung, meanwhile, sort of trying to control the situation, keeps talking that it was Park Hong-yon's evil Park Hong-yon's cow, quietly admitting that there are some problems and going to change it. What's happening next? At the same time, May. We see as the Soviet documents first signs of an emerging conspiracy. When I say conspiracy, it's a bit more complicated. It's not really, but it's sort of conspiracy. A bit later, whether we can describe this activity as conspiracy. We see signs that opposition is getting more and more radical. In late May, Isanjo, who is ambassador, who is in Moscow, back in Moscow, talks to Fedorenko, the deputy minister of, he was the head of the Far Eastern department at that time, person who was responsible for Far East, and he begins to talk about Kim Il-sung policy in a highly critical manner. He basically says that the Soviet leaders should do, essentially education session when Kim Il-sung would come to Moscow. Because Isanjo knew that Kim Il-sung actually initially it was expected that he would go in mid-May, then it was postponed, it was June, July, a bit later. And Isanjo says that something has to be basically done about his line. He should be just talked away from his dangerous policy. He should be pushed towards de-Stalinization and new policy. Around the same time, first signs of discontent among the officials. Some officials are getting unusually frank when they are talking to the Soviet diplomats. And on the 1st of June, Kim Il-sung is departing for a long, I believe it was second longest overseas trip in his life, in his political career as a leader of North Korea. He is going to via Moscow. First, he goes through Moscow. Back then he still was flying, not playing. He eventually developed a notorious, fear of flying. Back then he was going there by plane, and then from Moscow he went to entire Eastern Europe asking for money. Because the major goal of this trip was to get aid. If you look earlier publications, they usually say he did not get aid. Actually he did. Not as much as he hoped for, but sufficient enough. He was going to all these countries, and on his way back to Moscow, he did have a meeting with Khrushchev, where Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders spent a long time, it's not clear how long, but we are talking about a couple of hours at least, if not longer, explaining Kim Il-sung that he should behave differently. Of course, when you are lectured by the Soviet leader in Moscow, in the Soviet leader's office, it's not a good idea to start arguing. Therefore, he definitely admitted all his mistakes and promised to fix things. But by that time, he probably, we don't know for sure, he already had communication that situation in Pyongyang is getting out of control. Because if you want to have a coup, the best moment for having a coup is when the leader is away. So, starting from June, not only Soviet Koreans who sometimes visited the Soviet embassy, but many Chinese Koreans began to come to the Soviet embassy, talk to the people there, to talk to the Soviet diplomats, briefing them about the situation. They were saying that Kim Il-sung is creating a disastrous situation, that his policy resulted in the deprivation and destitution of the current people, that he is promoting his power base and the guerrillas at the expense of the respect for the Soviet role in liberation of Korea. It was kind of trying to push the right buttons, because back then Soviet diplomats, basically all Soviet people, were quite proud about being liberators of Korea, and that your role has been denied. It's painful, which was true, it was denied, indeed. And all this type of talks. So it was a great deal of communication, and they basically explained what they are going to do. They were going to wait for the next plenary meeting of the Central Committee and vote Kim Il-sung out of power. Was it a conspiracy? Big question. Because it was perfectly legal within the then existent legal framework. And Kim Il-sung was elected as a party leader by the Central Committee. And the Central Committee had the right to recall him. And if you look at the history of the communist bloc, we see other countries where similar things did happen. So, it was an opposition plan. And Kim Il-sung came back and learned, probably he was still overseas, but he learned about the plan, and he began to take measures to basically paralyze the plan of these reforms. It's not clear whether they were, how far they were going to go and whom they saw as replacement, even though it seems that their candidate was Chue Chan-ik, a prominent pro-North Korean, pro-Chinese politician, with Park Chan-ok being his probably second in command, and Lee Sang-jo likely to be a minister of foreign affairs. But this stuff emerged much later and cannot be taken for basically at face value. So Kim Il-sung was facing this growing trend. The problems kept escalating from 1954. And the decisive battle came at the August plenum, the 30th and the 31st of August. And the opposition attack ended with a complete disaster. We know about 10 people who had expressed support for their opposition and were members of the Central Committee. Yes, Central Committee is a kind of executive ruling committee of Korean Workers' Party, of any communist party. Back then it had about, I don't remember exactly, 60, 65, 70 people. And we know that, well, slightly less than 10 had expressed their support for the idea, for the opposition. At least one had expressed support, but it was Kim Do-won, of all people, titular head of the North Korean state at that time. He said that it's, opposition might be right, but they have no chances to win. So he basically said he's not going to press. So, anyway, but Kim Il-sung knew about the counterattack, and he mobilized the support of the majority of the Central Committee members. So, the opposition, they had a pretty naive expectation. Once they will start delivering such persuasive speeches, the top officials will realize suddenly that, Kim Il-sung had been wrong and they would vote for a new policy, or maybe new leadership. It was absolutely naive. Because Kim Il-sung controlled real resources, he approached people. We don't know how much bribing and blackmail has been done, but we can be sure it was a lot. But again, let's not simplify these things. The fact that, probably many people here, including myself, by the way, for the record, don't like Kim Il-sung policy and believe that in the end of the day it ended in a disaster, does not mean that this policy was not attractive to many Central Committee members. Let's not fool ourselves in the belief that these people supported Kim Il-sung only because they were blackmailed or bribed. Many of them shared Kim Il-sung's vision of the future. They also did not care about how much pork is eaten by the farmer. It's not that they didn't like farms, but they believe that guns are more important than butter. Then in the end of the day, if you have guns, eventually you will have butter. But if you have butter and no guns, you will lose butter. Like it or not, it's sort of logic, do you agree? Once again, most of these people did not care because, yes, it was a bit of luxurious life by the then North Korean standards. But you can read what the top officials, when they were quite frank, how they described their own life back then. In 1955, a deputy minister of culture of North Korea, he said, a former Soviet colonel, eventually he became colonel, officer in the Soviet Marines, he said that basically my lifestyle, and he being Soviet Korean, he visited Russia quite frequently, he said, my living standards are probably slightly inferior to living standards of a skilled worker in Moscow. And let's not forget that 1955 was not the year when skilled workers in Moscow enjoyed luxurious life. And he continued, but I have no idea how mid-ranking officials, let alone a common person, can survive on such income. So these people had very tough life, and they had tough life before. So for them, pork was not important. They were, I would say, murderous idealists. Exactly the type of people who created so much bloodshed in the 20th century. So they believed that Kim Il-sung's idea made sense. It resonated very well with their experience, their values. While all this talk about, less control, less censorship of the arts and media, and collective leadership, and more freedom for culture did not resonate well with a farmer who was 16 years old when he joined a guerrilla group, who barely survived in Manchuria, rose to, say, two-star general in the North Korean army, and he was not going to change the policy line of his country to allow more freedom of artistic creation. Just different types. Not all of them. As you see, Isanjo was just essentially was absolutely taken by these new ideas. So, what's happened during the plan? Complete disaster. Only one of the participants, Yoon Dong-hoon, managed to deliver the speech. Everybody rose to their feet, and they began to yell, and according to some reports, not all agree, began even to throw something like, some heavy objects to the speakers, and they were essentially immediately silenced. And when you see the reports of this plenum, you see that these people immediately, the opposition began to disintegrate immediately. Some of their leaders essentially say few hours later, maybe a couple of hours later, when they saw they are losing support, they began to basically think about saving their skin. They began to deliver repentance and say, I was bad, I was wrong, blah, 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 as if it was going to save them. There is a bit of poetic or non-poetic justice in the fact that if you look what happened eventually to these people, not only opposition, but the people who helped to silence opposition, most of them died pretty horrible, not most of them, but many, not most, but many, eventually died pretty horrible deaths. Because as long as they were not part of the inner circle, many of them became victims of the purges in the 1960s. But back then, they shared Kim Il-sung belief, they supported Kim Il-sung, maybe because they were blackmailed, because they were bribed, and because they shared ideology. Humans are difficult, you cannot usually distinguish fear, material interest, and sincere ideological inclination, they're saying. Having said that, so, and everything ended in complete collapse. The four most prominent leaders of the opposition were immediately expelled, two of them were expelled from the party, and others from the Central Committee, and they were basically put, three of them were put on, five were expelled, yeah. They were put on under house arrest, and then something surprising happened. they escaped. You know, obviously the North Korean police simply did not expect serious domestic resistance. But they were dealing with tough people, lifelong underground operatives, waiting for their fate, managed to get away from the house, got a car of one of their friends who was helping them, and rushed to the Chinese border. They crossed the border at early morning, and then a kind of, how do you say, in the Wild West, when, you know, sheriff is running, Russian is called posse, chase party, whichever. Posse. When posse reached the border, it was a couple of hours late. They were already in China, and the Vice Minister of the Interior crossed the river. He approached the Chinese head of local police in the county, which is now called Dandun. Now, back then it was called Andun. And he basically said, give us back. No, they're not normal refugees, sorry. And in no time they were in Canada. Escape. And they had very good connections in the Chinese Communist Party, and they began to tell to the Korean that something seriously wrong was happening in Korea. And Mao had very little love for Kim Il-sung. Exactly how little love Mao had for Kim Il-sung can be illustrated by one case. In 1956, Mao, soon after this event they are talking about, had a lengthy conversation with Ambassador Julian, the Soviet ambassador to Beijing, about Kim Il-sung. And this conversation, years later, in the early 1960s, was deliberately shown to Kim Il-sung by the Soviet diplomats to drive a wedge between North Korea and China. It was stupid. It was something that is absolutely. Anyway, I felt ashamed when I was reading these documents, because it's not how normal policy can be conducted. Well, it's a stupid idea. Looks like it was done by the then Secretary of Central Committee Kozlov, his idea. But it was, this stuff was seen as sufficiently compromising. It was expected that Kim Il-sung would go ballistic and change policy of North Korea. Of course, he did not. He did go ballistic, but he did not change the policy, because back then, balancing between China and Soviet Union was basically serving North Korean interest. It's a very common mistake to expect for any politician worthy of his or her job, that, you know, personal emotions will influence strategic decision making. But anyway, it shows a kind of dislike. So, and meanwhile, let's go back to Moscow. Once it happened, on the 1st of September, a cable was sent by Ambassador Ivanov, who said that things are getting out of control in Pyongyang. And a few days later, Yi Sang-jo wrote a letter where he drafted a plan, which, as we will see soon, was basically carried forward. Ambassador Yi Sang-jo suggested that the Soviet Union should, it was a letter to Mikoyan, who was then responsible, Anastas Mikoyan, for dealing with the communist bloc, and Khrushchev. It was a letter to them where they suggested that Soviet Union, maybe separately, maybe with China. Well, I should read the letter when I was preparing for the lecture. I read it about I don't remember whether he said only Soviet or Soviet in China. But the basic idea is sent a delegation to Pyongyang to demand revision of the August plenum decision, pardon for all participants of the opposition, and promise to change the policy. And it was, you know, September. On the 6th of September, the Soviet Politburo met to discuss the situation in North Korea, and they decided to basically that Mikoyan, who was going to Beijing, to China anyway, he should proceed eventually to Pyongyang and to do something. And it was done. On the 23rd of September, Mikoyan and Pende Huai, together, a joint delegation, arrived to Pyongyang to do exactly what Mr. Kissinger dreams about now. Not exactly regime change. Just recently, I learned that somebody, not me unfortunately, discovered new documents which show that they were not going to change Kim Il-sung in September, as I sort of suspected, but that they were just going to change his policy line. Kim Il-sung, facing Mikoyan and Tandukoi, admitted that he would, from now on, he would behave himself, that he would follow the UCOS line. He accepted it, and he promised that all new decisions would be published in the official documents, in the official newspapers, in the official North Korean newspapers. Mikoyan and Tandukoi left, but nothing happened. Kim Il-sung was not going to give the promise, which was essentially, he was blackmailed into giving. Material has never been published, and virtually 2 weeks later, he said to the Soviet ambassador that I did not say we would publish it. I just said we would consider publishing it. We would discuss publishing it. Absolutely. And, well, of course, they had a discussion and decided not to publish the stuff. And then all, for a brief while, for a few months, purchase stopped and then resumed. Isanjo, in October 1956, officially asked for Soviet asylum, which was granted, and then a chain of defection of the North Korean officials in the Soviet Union, in Bulgaria and China happened. Soviet Union and China, for that matter, granted asylum to the defecting North Korean officials, while also making sure that they would not be capable of, they would not be involved with a political activity. So, and then essentially all this attempt ended in nothing. People who in any way were sympathetic were purged. As I said, Isanjo defected. Park Ivan lost his job in 1957 to die or be in prison or be executed soon afterwards. And a massive purge of the Chinese and Soviet officials, or really Korean officials with Chinese and Soviet background, began. The era of the Soviet and Chinese influence ended. I just have one question. Why did not Soviet Union and China force the September decision in 1956-1957? I don't know. Probably because of the general developments in Eastern Europe, where crisis in Poland and revolution in Hungary demonstrated that the local popular masses are not really necessarily going to lead the new system, and probably instead of liberalized communism would demand something different. And probably the growing schism between Soviet Union and China. So the Soviet Union didn't want to exercise too much pressure because it would alienate people. It would probably make, it would basically push North Korea towards China. And for roughly, 30 years, it was a major nightmare of the Soviet diplomats that by some mistake North Korea would go to the Chinese side. All things together, but, as I have described, the only known attempt of an active intervention into the North Korean politics, and not necessarily regime change, but something close to that, ended in a complete failure in the time when the great powers which undertook such an attempt had what appeared to be an absolute control of the North Korean top leadership. I think it's enough. And if we need connection, some kind of connection with the current affairs, which is something I'm most emphatically not going to do today, I will say it's something which I cannot help but thinking when I read some editorial in some major Western, usually American newspaper, telling that the United States should finally make regime change in Pyongyang its major goal. I don't mind, but first we saw how it happened when it could be done much easier. And second, no matter what American government says, North Korean decision makers have always been certain that the regime change is the American goal. And they have made a lot of preparations to make sure that this goal is not going to be easy. Yes, and we have 10 minutes something for questions. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, but once again, I'm sorry to say, most emphatically, I'm not going to answer questions about current policy.
Thank you, Professor Lanko, for the big time. One simple and straightforward question. As far as Korean War is concerned, have you managed to find any kind of evidence that Stalin in those Korean War, in order to lure United States into the war, I mean, in order to divert their interest and resources from Europe?
No. Actually, I would say I see some evidence because the preparation of the Korean War is extremely well studied. All relevant Russian papers have been published by Torkunov, who is not just a humble Russian historian, but has been is at high-level official, essentially deputy minister, above ambassadorial level, and he is remarkable in his political skills because he has survived on his highly sensitive job for basically 25 years. And he published all this stuff about 10 years ago. And all this stuff basically says something that when in April, basically Stalin was against the war. We have 47 known cables, if I remember, I believe it was you who counted them, correct? Still 47, maybe something new has emerged, but say about 50. Cables that where Kim Il-sung was asking for permission to attack, and Stalin said no. In one case, even the Soviet ambassador got instruction to make sure that North Korea would not do anything silly. Having said that, and if you see records of his talk in April 1950 with Kim Il-sung and Stalin and Park Hon-yon, the issue of the American intervention was very large, and Stalin did not expect that Americans will intervene. Stalin had reports of the intelligence, especially Howard, again I have to ask Dr. Desasbai, what is the number of this National Security Council resolution? NSC 48. Because the Soviet agents stole a top secret American paper which explicitly excluded South Korea from the countries which should be protected in case of war. Everybody knows about the speech in the press club, but Stalin probably would not pay much attention to open speeches, but he had a top secret document. So his first assumption was Americans would not intervene, but he said a number of times that if Americans get involved, we are not going to get involved.
Oh, really?
He said it explicitly to Kim Il-sung. We have records, we have cables. He said, if you want a war, if you say you are going to win, fight. But I'm washing hands. I'll give you tanks, I'll give you support, I'll send you advisors, but not a single Russian soldier is going to fight.
Okay.
And when in early October, North Korea essentially nearly lost the war, Stalin, according to memoirs of Khrushchev, said, well, Americans are going to become our neighbors, obviously. Not only in Chukotka, nothing about but in Korea too. So he sort of was reluctantly willing to admit. So of course, once the war began, when it became possible that with the Chinese support, North Koreans are capable of keeping Americans involved, Stalin was happy. And he did try to prolong the war as long as possible to keep Americans occupied, but it was not his initial plan. He was just made a good use of situation, which developed completely against his initial expectations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other?
Yeah. Why were the Soviet Koreans and the Yan'an faction, why were they so naive? You know, at the plenum, do you think it's more structural? They lacked resources. They were constrained by the Sino-Soviet whatnot, whereas Kim Il-sung wasn't, or just personality? Were they not as willing to go to the lengths of, purging and violence? How do you read their...
For me, it's a secret. I don't understand, frankly. When I see how these people were talking, and when I thought about their past, and we know a lot about these people, and we have some research being done now by, I can say he's a young historian, he's roughly of my age, he's new for the field, Igor Selivanov, who is publishing their biographies right now. They were really tough, street smart people, who combined ideological commitment, they were idealists, with a great deal of street smartness. You cannot survive running underground operation if you are naive. You have to be a good judge of people who have been unbelievably suspicious, everything. But by some reasons, I don't know. Because everything looks so amateurish, so poorly organized. And frankly, I hate to say it, but these people behave like cowards. In May, when they saw the first sign of collapse, they immediately began to run away and change sides. Even those who before or later has shown themselves to be really brave and courageous people. So for me it's a bit of secret. I misread them.
When Russia and North Korea started to grow apart in 56,
56, 57. I would say 57.
Did China embrace North Korea more eagerly and try to make effort to
Yes.
become more a close ally?
Yes, but not exactly. What happened? Very briefly. The beginning of collapse, or the collapse of the earlier unequal alliance, when North Korea was definitely a junior partner, but it was an alliance and very unequal, began indeed in 1957, and roughly at the time when the schism began to develop between Russia and China. And one of the last attempt, I have no time to talk about it, but the last attempt to push North Korea into behaving itself according to the new standards took place in October 1957. But the plan which was drafted, and it has been declassified, this plan implied that North Korea, that Soviet Union would act together with China. So the idea was of another joint diplomatic operation with China. And China, on that stage, refused to participate. Even more, in 1957, Mao Zedong officially met, in Moscow, met Kim Il-sung, and behind the closed doors, but quite officially, expressed his regret about September plenum, about Chinese attempts to intervene, which was largely done exactly to drive the wedge between, as you have said, Russia and North Korea. Look, Russians are still pushing you, but I'm a good Chinese, I'm understanding you. You have to tell this Russians. Anyway, but yes, of course, China wanted, and for a while China succeeded. Between 1961 and 1965, North Korea was one of a small number of pro-Chinese communist states. However, it did not last. Because around 1965, Mao first discovered that Chinese cultural revolution might be even more dangerous than the Soviet destabilization. Second, he discovered that in spite of all the talks about peaceful coexistence, Soviet Union was willing to support North Vietnam, while China was providing North Vietnam with much less significant aid, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Soviet aid to North Vietnam, in spite of all these peaceful coexistence talks, was much greater than aid from China. So, and finally, Kim Il-sung discovered that China had no resources, neither will nor largely just ability, to support North Korea's economy by grants, by subsidized trade and everything. So, from 1965, he moved to pretty much, not exactly, we can move a long time about some minor changes in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but generally it was a policy of maneuvering between China and Russia. Sometimes closer to Moscow, sometimes closer to Beijing, but it was essentially a neutral line from 1965. So yes, China tried, yes, China succeeded, but only for a while.
Okay, so One more? Okay, last question.
What did Mao say about Kim Il-sung?
Julian, the direct manner of conversation by Julian and Mao, I could not find, but just say, I know, yes, first from quotes you can reconstruct, and they did reconstruct it in a chapter in my forthcoming book. Unfortunately, it's going to be published in Korean. But basically about 2 weeks ago, I learned that somebody else got the map, and I hope as a part of, dealing with. So I think that in due time, probably November this year, I will finally get the document.
Okay, so thank you very much for